On a weather map of North America, we watch as colors shift slowly across the continent. The date is late January 2019, and something unusual is happening in the atmosphere high above the Arctic. A mass of cold air that normally circles the polar region has begun to sag southward, pushing down through Canada and into the heart of the United States. Meteorologists are calling it a polar vortex event, and in the days ahead, it will bring some of the coldest temperatures many Americans have experienced in a generation. The polar vortex itself is not new. It exists year-round, a persistent low-pressure zone that spins counterclockwise over the Arctic, held in place by the jet stream like water swirling in a bowl. In most winters, it stays where it belongs, far to the north, affecting only the highest latitudes. But occasionally, disruptions in the upper atmosphere cause the vortex to wobble, and when it does, lobes of that frigid polar air can spill southward, carried by shifting winds into regions that are not prepared for such cold. In January 2019, one of these lobes descended over the American Midwest and pushed eastward toward the Great Lakes and beyond. Wind chill temperatures in parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. In Chicago, the temperature fell to -23 degrees, with wind chills making it feel far worse. Even New York City, more accustomed to cold winters than the Deep South, but still unaccustomed to such extremes, felt the reach of the polar air. Temperatures dropped well below zero, with wind chills approaching dangerous levels. The effects rippled across systems that modern life depends on. Flights were canceled by the thousands, as airports in Chicago, Minneapolis, and other cities shut down or operated on reduced schedules. Commuter trains slowed or stopped entirely, as tracks and switches froze in the bitter cold. Schools closed across multiple states, leaving millions of children home unexpectedly. In some areas, natural gas systems strained under unprecedented demand, and parts of the electric grid struggled to keep up with the need for heat. Pipes froze in homes and businesses, bursting when the ice expanded, leaving families without water and facing costly repairs. Tonight, we are going to walk through those days slowly and quietly. We will stay close to the ordinary details of life during extreme cold. The frost that formed on apartment windows, the steam rising from subway grates, the sound of furnaces running through the night. We will watch how cities adapted, how neighbors helped each other, how workers kept essential services running despite conditions that made every outdoor task difficult and sometimes dangerous. By minute 2, we will be looking at a weather map again, watching the deep blue and purple colors of the cold spread over the Great Lakes and toward the eastern seaboard. By minute 4, we will be standing on a New York City street at dawn, feeling the sharp bite of the air and noticing how few people are out compared to a normal morning. By minute 6, we will step inside a small apartment where a family has gathered in one room, keeping the heat focused, letting faucets drip slowly to protect the pipes from freezing. This is a calm, non-graphic telling of a recent winter event. We will acknowledge that some people faced difficult conditions, that there were power outages and frozen pipes and genuine hardship in certain areas. But we will describe these things quietly and without alarm, focusing on how people adapted and helped each other through a few unusual days. You do not need to prepare yourself for anything startling. You can simply listen as we move through the cold, one careful step at a time. The polar vortex of 2019 was not a disaster in the way that hurricanes or earthquakes are disasters. It was more like an interruption, a few days when the normal rhythms of life slowed down and people paid closer attention to basic things: warmth, shelter, food, and connection. In the Midwest, where the cold was most intense, the pause was more profound. In the Northeast, including New York City, the impact was real but more moderate, a reminder that even a large and modern city is not immune to the forces of weather. As we begin, we are simply placing ourselves on the map. It is late January 2019. The cold is moving south, and across the country, people are beginning to notice that this winter is about to become something different. If you've drifted and returned, we've just set our place on the map in January 2019. We are watching the cold begin to move south toward cities that will soon feel its presence in frost on windows and silence on streets. In the days before the coldest temperatures arrived, there were signs for those paying attention. Weather forecasters had been tracking the polar vortex disruption for more than a week. By mid-January, their models were converging on a clear picture. A significant intrusion of Arctic air was coming, and it would affect a broad swath of the country from the upper Midwest to the eastern seaboard. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issued advisories, and local weather services began to amplify the message. This would not be an ordinary cold snap. In New York City, the warnings filtered into daily life gradually. People checking their phones in the morning saw forecasts with temperatures they rarely encountered. Single digits, then below zero, with wind chills that pushed the numbers even lower. The phrasing in these forecasts was unusually direct. Phrases like life-threatening cold and dangerous wind chills appeared on screens in kitchens and on subway platforms, language that caught the eye even of New Yorkers accustomed to ignoring weather predictions. The first physical signs were subtle. A Thursday morning might feel sharper than the Wednesday before, the cold biting a little more insistently at cheeks and fingers during the walk to the subway. Frost appeared on apartment windows overnight, delicate patterns of ice crystals that caught the early light. On sidewalks, patches of ice that would normally melt during the day stayed frozen, shiny and treacherous underfoot. The steam rising from subway grates seemed thicker than usual, a visible reminder of the temperature difference between the tunnels below and the air above. In offices and schools, conversations turned to the coming cold. Colleagues shared forecasts with each other, comparing the predicted lows and the wind chill values. Teachers reminded students to wear layers the next day. Parents began to wonder whether school would be canceled, checking district websites and news channels for announcements that had not yet come. There was a particular quality to these conversations, a mix of skepticism and mild concern. Cold snaps happened every winter, after all. But the numbers being discussed were unusual, and the tone of the forecasts was more urgent than people remembered hearing before. Grocery stores saw a quiet surge of activity in the days before the coldest weather arrived. Shoppers filled their carts with bread, milk, eggs, and canned goods, the traditional supplies for any weather event. The checkout lines were a little longer than usual, but there was no panic, just a methodical stocking up. In hardware stores, space heaters and bags of rock salt moved briskly from shelves to carts to car trunks. Some customers asked about pipe insulation, remembering warnings they had heard about letting faucets drip to prevent freezing. In apartment buildings across the city, maintenance staff checked heating systems and made adjustments where needed. Radiators that had been lukewarm suddenly seemed more important, and tenants who might normally complain about overheated rooms found themselves grateful for the warmth. Landlords and building managers sent notices reminding residents to keep heat on, to report any problems immediately, and to let water trickle in sinks overnight if temperatures dropped as predicted. The rhythm of the city continued largely uninterrupted in these early days. Subways ran on schedule. Buses moved along their routes. People went to work and school and came home again. But underneath the routine, there was a current of preparation, small adjustments being made in anticipation of something that had not yet arrived. Extra blankets were pulled from closets. Thermostats were turned up a degree or two. Pets were given shorter outdoor time, their walks abbreviated by owners who noticed the cold and wanted to get back inside. In the Midwest, where the cold would arrive first and hit hardest, the preparations were more intense. Chicago residents who had lived through harsh winters before still noted that this one felt different. The forecast spoke of temperatures not seen in decades, wind chills that could cause frostbite in minutes, conditions that would make being outside genuinely dangerous. Schools announced closures before the cold even arrived, and employers began to discuss work-from-home arrangements for the most dangerous days. Through apartment windows across the affected regions, people watched the world outside with a particular attentiveness. The sky seemed lower than usual, a flat gray that pressed down on rooftops and streets. The light had a quality that photographers sometimes call flat, even and shadowless, stripping the landscape of contrast. It was the light of an approaching weather system, the visual precursor to the cold that the forecasts promised. In living rooms and kitchens, the glow of lamps and screens provided warmth that was as much psychological as physical. Families gathered in the rooms where heat was concentrated, instinctively choosing shared spaces over scattered ones. The television might show a weather map, the spreading blue and purple colors indicating where the coldest air would go. Or it might show something else entirely, a movie or a show, offering distraction from the weather that was coming. The city was still functioning, still moving, still alive with all its usual activity. But there was a quality of anticipation in the air, a sense that the normal rules were about to be suspended, at least for a few days. People who might normally stay out late chose to head home earlier. Those who had errands to run tried to complete them before the cold arrived in full force. And everywhere in small ways, the preparation continued. A scarf placed by the door, a phone charger plugged in, a cabinet left open beneath a sink to let warm air reach the pipes. If your attention has wandered, we are in the days just before the real plunge. Forecasts speak of danger while streets still look almost ordinary, and the cold is still gathering its strength to the north. When the coldest air arrived, the transportation systems that kept cities connected began to struggle. In Chicago, O'Hare International Airport, one of the busiest in the world, saw flight cancellations climb into the thousands. Planes sat on tarmacs with de-icing fluid freezing on their wings faster than it could be applied. Jetways contracted in the cold, refusing to align properly with aircraft doors. Baggage handlers worked in shifts measured in minutes rather than hours, rotating inside to warm up before returning to the bitter cold. In Minneapolis and other Midwestern cities, the situation was similar. Airports that prided themselves on operating through harsh winters found themselves overwhelmed by the depth and duration of the cold. Flights that might normally depart with minor delays were canceled outright. Passengers gathered in terminal lobbies, some rebooking for later in the week, others making alternative plans entirely. The departure boards filled with the word, CANCELLED in red, a visual catalog of disrupted journeys. The effects spread outward from the airports. Connecting flights through Chicago and Minneapolis were disrupted, creating ripples that reached airports across the country and even overseas. Travelers in New York who had planned to fly through the Midwest found themselves stranded or rerouted. Business meetings were postponed. Family visits were delayed. The intricate web of air travel, which normally moves millions of people each day, slowed to a fraction of its usual pace. On the ground, commuter rail systems faced their own challenges. In Chicago, Metra crews set small fires along the tracks, a technique called switch heating that keeps the metal components of railroad switches from freezing in place. The sight was striking. Flames flickering along the rail lines, visible from passing trains and nearby buildings, a reminder of how basic the battle against cold can become. Despite these efforts, some lines operated on reduced schedules, and delays accumulated as the cold continued. In New York City, the subway system fared better, sheltered as it is beneath the streets. But the portions of the system that run above ground, in the outer boroughs, experienced problems. As switches froze. Third rails, which provide electric power to the trains, became less efficient in the extreme cold. Delays accumulated, and riders bundled on platforms watched digital signs recalculate arrival times with growing frustration. The usual rhythm of the commute, already stressed by ordinary winter conditions, became slower and less predictable. Buses, exposed to the elements in ways that subways are not, struggled across the affected regions. Diesel fuel thickened in tanks. Hydraulic systems for doors and wheelchair lift became sluggish. Drivers reported difficulty keeping windshields clear, the defrosters fighting a losing battle against air that wanted to freeze everything it touched. In some cities, bus service was reduced or suspended entirely on the coldest days, with officials deciding that the risks to drivers and passengers outweighed the benefits of maintaining routes. On highways and interstates, the cold brought its own hazards. Black ice formed on bridges and overpasses, surfaces that lose heat faster than the roads they connect. Cars that had been driving normally suddenly found themselves sliding, brakes useless against the frictionless surface. In the Midwest, where the cold was most intense, authorities closed stretches of highway entirely. They judged that the combination of ice, wind, and extreme temperature made travel too dangerous to permit. State troopers and emergency responders patrolled what roads remained open, ready to assist motorists who encountered trouble. In New York, ferries that connected Staten Island to Manhattan and other waterway routes operated on modified schedules. Ice formed on the rivers and harbors, not thick enough to halt boat traffic but sufficient to slow it and to require extra caution. The decks of ferries became treacherous, and passengers who might normally enjoy the outdoor views stayed inside the heated cabins, watching the gray cityscape pass through windows that fogged with their breath. The cumulative effect of these disruptions was a quieting of movement. Cities that normally hummed with the constant motion of vehicles and people grew slower, more deliberate. Rush hours that typically clogged highways and filled transit cars became muted, with fewer travelers and more empty seats. The visual evidence was everywhere. Parking lots with unclaimed spaces, platforms with room to stand comfortably, streets where a pedestrian could walk for a block without encountering another person. For those who did need to travel, the experience was one of careful navigation. Drivers who ventured out did so slowly, testing their brakes, watching the road surface for any sign of ice. Pedestrians walked with deliberate steps, placing their feet carefully on sidewalks that might betray them at any moment. The normal pace of urban life, usually rushed and impatient, gave way to something slower and more cautious. In the stillness, there was also a kind of beauty. Empty train platforms have a particular quiet, the usual noise of crowds replaced by the echo of a single pair of footsteps. Snow-covered highways stretch toward horizons that feel closer when no other vehicles interrupt the view. The ferries moved across water that reflected the gray sky, their lights glowing in the early dusk, almost alone on routes normally crowded with marine traffic. If you've come back to us, we are watching travel slow to a crawl. Planes, trains, and long highways fall quiet in the deepening cold, and the normal motion of cities gives way to careful stillness. As the transportation system slowed, a different kind of quiet settled over the affected cities. Offices that would normally be filled with workers stood empty, their lights off, their parking lots nearly vacant. Schools that would echo with the sounds of children remained silent, doors locked, playgrounds covered in undisturbed snow. The usual rhythms of weekday life, the commutes and the meetings and the lunch hour errands, were suspended as people stayed home and watched the cold from inside. In New York City, the streets took on an unfamiliar stillness. Avenues that typically thrummed with taxi traffic saw only occasional vehicles, their headlights cutting through the gray morning air. The usual soundtrack of horns and engines and voices faded, replaced by something closer to quiet, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of a plow. Pedestrians who did venture out walked quickly, heads down, focused on reaching their destinations and getting back inside. The view from apartment windows became a study in absence. Where there would normally be people waiting at bus stops, there were empty benches. Where there would normally be delivery trucks double parked, there were open stretches of curb. The city that never sleeps had not exactly gone to sleep, but it had certainly slowed down. Its energy turned inward toward the warmth of buildings and the glow of screens. Inside those buildings, life continued in modified form. People who might normally commute to offices worked from kitchen tables and living room couches, laptops open, video calls replacing in-person meetings. The technology that allowed this kind of remote work held up remarkably well. Internet service, carried through cables that ran underground or were protected by insulation, functioned normally in most areas. Cell phone networks maintained their coverage, their towers and equipment designed to withstand a range of temperatures. But the connection to the outside world, even through functioning technology, felt different during the cold snap. Scrolling through news on a phone while sitting in a warm apartment, watching footage of frozen Chicago streets or reading about canceled flights created a strange sense of simultaneity. People were safe and comfortable, while also aware that something unusual was happening just beyond the walls. Social media filled with images of the cold, photographs of thermometer readings and frost patterns, and the steam rising from manholes, a collective documentation of the experience. In rural areas and smaller towns, the technological connections were sometimes less reliable. Some cell towers, particularly in remote locations, struggled with the cold. Backup batteries drained faster in low temperatures, and technicians who might normally perform quick repairs faced conditions that made outdoor work dangerous. Broadband internet, delivered through lines that might run through exposed areas, experienced outages in some locations. For residents in these areas, the isolation was more complete. The normal lifelines to the outside world temporarily disrupted. Emergency alert systems sent messages to phones across the affected regions. The familiar buzzing tone, usually associated with severe thunderstorms or amber alerts, now carried warnings about extreme cold. The language was clinical but urgent. Life-threatening wind chills expected. Limit time outdoors. Check on neighbors. People who received these alerts read them, and then looked out their windows at streets that already seemed to be heeding the advice. For those who lived alone, the cold days brought a particular quality of solitude. The usual casual encounters that punctuate daily life, the brief conversation with a neighbor in the hallway, the exchange with a cashier at the corner store, the nod to a regular at the coffee shop, largely ceased as people stayed inside. Phone calls and text messages replaced face-to-face contact. the voice of a friend or family member coming through a speaker instead of across a table. The silence on the streets was matched by a quiet in the buildings themselves. Without the usual comings and goings, apartment hallways were still. Stairwells that might normally echo with footsteps were empty. The sounds of the building itself became more noticeable. The hum of the heating system, the occasional clank of radiators, the creak of floors expanding and contracting with temperature changes. These were the sounds of a structure working to maintain warmth, while the cold pressed against it from outside. Through windows touched with frost at their edges, the world outside appeared both familiar and strange. The same buildings and streets were there, recognizable in their shapes and positions. But the absence of movement, the lack of the human activity that normally animates urban landscapes, gave them an unfamiliar quality. It was as if the city had been photographed rather than experienced, a still image rather than a living place. As evening approached on those cold days, the early darkness added to the sense of withdrawal. Lights came on in windows across the city, each one marking an apartment where people were gathered, staying warm, waiting for the weather to ease. The glow of those windows against the dark sky was a kind of communication in itself, a visual signal that life continued inside even as the streets below remained empty and still. If you've been dozing, we are in the quieter hours now. Cities that usually hum with motion have pulled indoors and let the streets rest, and the glow of windows becomes the main sign of life in the winter evening. Inside the homes where people waited out the cold, a particular set of rituals developed. These were not dramatic actions, but small, practical adjustments, the kind of adaptations that happen when normal life is interrupted and basic needs become more visible. The goal was simple: stay warm, protect the infrastructure of daily life, and wait for the weather to pass. In apartments and houses across the affected regions, families made decisions about which rooms to keep warmest. In homes with central heating, this might mean adjusting vents or closing doors to concentrate warmth in the main living spaces. In apartments with radiators, it meant staying close to those heat sources, arranging furniture so that the warmest spots were easily accessible. The geography of the home shifted, with some rooms effectively closed off and others becoming the center of all activity. The most common ritual was the dripping faucet. In kitchens and bathrooms across the cold regions, people left taps running at a slow but steady trickle. The principle is simple. Moving water is harder to freeze than standing water. The thin stream running into the sink throughout the night might seem wasteful under normal circumstances, but during extreme cold, it was insurance against a much more costly problem. Frozen pipes can burst when ice expands inside them, causing water damage that can take weeks or months to repair. Cabinet doors beneath sinks were left open, allowing the warmer air of the room to circulate around the pipes. This too was a small action with practical significance. Pipes that run along exterior walls or in unheated spaces are particularly vulnerable to freezing. By opening the cabinet doors, homeowners created a path for heated air to reach these vulnerable points. It was the kind of knowledge that spread through communities during cold snaps, passed from neighbor to neighbor, or remembered from previous winters. The thermostat became an object of particular attention. People who might normally set it and forget it now checked it regularly, adjusting a degree or two in response to how the house felt or how the weather outside was changing. Some turned the heat up higher than they normally would, accepting higher utility bills in exchange for the security of knowing their homes were warm enough to protect against frozen pipes. Others, mindful of costs or of the strain on utility systems, found a balance, keeping temperatures adequate but not excessive. Layering became a way of life. People wore multiple shirts, sweaters over sweaters, socks doubled on their feet. Blankets that might normally stay folded at the foot of a bed were spread across couches and chairs, available for anyone who sat down. Some families moved mattresses into living rooms, creating communal sleeping areas where body heat could be shared, and where the warmth of the main heating source was most concentrated. Windows, those thin barriers between inside and outside, received special attention. Heavy curtains were drawn to add a layer of insulation against the cold pressing at the glass. Some people taped plastic sheeting over windows, creating an additional air gap that slowed the transfer of heat. Others placed rolled towels along windowsills to block drafts. The frost that formed on the inside of window panes became a measure of how cold it was outside, the patterns growing more elaborate as temperatures dropped. The activities that filled the hours were necessarily indoor ones. Children who might normally be at school or playing outside found other ways to occupy their time. Board games came out of closets. Streaming services saw increased traffic. Books that had been sitting unread on shelves finally got attention. Parents worked from home while also supervising children, a balancing act that added stress but also created unexpected time together. Meals became more deliberate. With going out inconvenient and delivery services limited, people cooked with what they had on hand. Soups and stews simmered on stovetops, providing warmth along with nourishment. Baking, which heats the kitchen as a side effect, became more popular. The smells of cooking filled apartments and houses, adding to the sense of home as a refuge against the cold outside. In the evenings, when darkness fell early and the temperature outside dropped even further, families gathered in the warmest rooms. The glow of lamps provided light and a subtle sense of comfort. Conversations happened that might not have happened on normal busy days. People who lived together but often moved on separate schedules found themselves sharing space and time in ways that felt both unusual and strangely normal. A return to a simpler pattern of living dictated by the weather. The sounds inside these homes formed their own quiet soundtrack. The hum of heating systems working, the occasional gurgle of water through pipes, the murmur of voices, the clatter of dishes being washed, the soft sound of pages turning or keyboards clicking. Outside, the wind might be howling, but inside these sounds created a sense of shelter, of safety from the cold that was pressing against the walls. If your thoughts have slipped away, we are inside now, in rooms that have become small shelters. Lamps and blankets are arranged against the cold, and the gentle sounds of domestic life fill the quiet hours. While many people weathered the cold in their own homes, others needed a different kind of shelter. Across the affected regions, cities and towns activated networks of warming centers, places where anyone could come to escape the dangerous cold, no questions asked. These centers became temporary refuges, offering warmth and basic comforts to those who needed them most. The locations varied. Public libraries, which normally served as quiet spaces for reading and research, transformed into warming centers during the cold snap. Their doors stayed open extended hours, and staff welcomed visitors who might normally have been asked to leave at closing time. The usual rules about quiet voices and limited food were relaxed. What mattered was that people had a warm place to sit, a chance to charge their phones, and access to restrooms and drinking water. Community centers and recreation facilities opened their doors as well. Gymnasiums that would normally host basketball games or fitness classes now held rows of folding chairs and, in some cases, cots for overnight stays. The fluorescent lights that usually illuminated athletic activity now shone on people wrapped in donated blankets, some sleeping, others simply sitting and waiting for conditions to improve. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious institutions played significant roles. Many had long-standing relationships with their communities and existing networks of volunteers. They opened fellowship halls and meeting rooms, setting up coffee urns and tables with donated food. The warmth they offered was both physical and social, a sense of community and care that went beyond simple temperature control. The people who came to these centers represented a cross-section of those most vulnerable to extreme cold. Some were experiencing homelessness, their usual outdoor locations now life-threateningly dangerous. Others were people whose home heating had failed, whether due to power outages, broken furnaces, or inability to pay utility bills. Still others were elderly residents who lived alone and whose apartments, while heated, felt unsafe during such extreme weather. A few were simply people who wanted company, the isolation of staying alone in a cold apartment becoming too much to bear. Outreach workers ventured into the cold to find those who might not come to warming centers on their own. In cities with large populations of unhoused people, these workers knew the locations where people typically sheltered: under bridges, in doorways, in parks and transit stations. They brought blankets, hand warmers, and information about where to find shelter. For some, they provided transportation, driving people to warming centers who might not otherwise have been able to reach them. The volunteers who staffed these centers came from various backgrounds. Some were affiliated with the organizations running the centers, regular volunteers who had experience with emergency response. Others were community members who simply showed up, wanting to help during an unusual situation. They poured coffee, distributed blankets, helped people find information, and provided the human presence that made these large, institutional spaces feel more welcoming. The atmosphere in warming centers was subdued, but not grim. People sat in small groups or alone, some talking quietly, others sleeping, still others staring at phones or simply at the walls. There was a quality of waiting to these spaces, a sense that everyone present was marking time until conditions changed. But there was also gratitude, expressed in small ways. A thank you to a volunteer pouring coffee, a nod between strangers sharing a table, the simple acknowledgement that being inside together was better than being outside alone. For children who found themselves in warming centers, the experience was confusing and sometimes exciting. The change in routine, the presence of many strangers, the cots and blankets that turned ordinary rooms into temporary sleeping quarters, all of this registered as unusual, an adventure of sorts. Parents and volunteers tried to maintain normalcy, setting up areas for play, distributing crayons and paper, keeping children occupied while adults dealt with the logistics of emergency shelter. The meals served at warming centers were simple but welcome. Soup was common, easy to prepare in large quantities and warming in a direct, physical way. Sandwiches, donated from local bakeries and restaurants, were distributed along with chips and fruit. Hot chocolate and coffee flowed continuously, their steam adding to the warmth of the rooms. For some visitors, these meals were the first hot food they had eaten in days. As evening fell and temperatures outside dropped further, the warming centers settled into their overnight rhythms. Lights were dimmed in sleeping areas, while remaining bright in spaces where people stayed awake. Volunteers took turns monitoring the doors, welcoming new arrivals even late into the night. The quiet sounds of a communal sleep space filled the rooms. Breathing, shifting, occasional coughs, the rustle of blankets being adjusted. Outside, the cold continued, but inside these spaces, warmth was shared and shelter was provided to anyone who needed it. If you have returned, we are in the shared spaces now. Warmth and light are pooled together and offered to anyone who needs them, and the community becomes visible in its care for its most vulnerable members. While most people sheltered indoors during the polar vortex, others had no choice but to work. Essential services do not stop for weather, and the workers who maintain them faced some of the most challenging conditions of the cold snap. Their efforts, often unseen by those who stayed inside, kept the basic systems of modern life functioning through the most extreme days. Utility workers were among the most exposed. Line crews from electric companies responded to outages caused by equipment failures, their bucket trucks lifting them into frigid air to repair transformers and reconnect severed lines. The work required bare hands for precision tasks, meaning that even with the best cold weather gear, workers faced direct exposure to temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes. Shifts were shortened, with crews rotating more frequently than usual to limit each person's time in the cold. Natural gas workers monitored systems that were under unprecedented strain. Demand for heating fuel had spiked as millions of homes and businesses turned up their thermostats, and the infrastructure that delivered gas to all those furnaces and boilers was working at or near capacity. Workers checked pressure levels, inspected equipment, and responded to reports of gas leaks or service interruptions. In some areas, utilities asked customers to lower their thermostats slightly to reduce demand and prevent system-wide failures. The electrical grid faced similar challenges. Power plants that might normally be in reserve were brought online to meet the surge in heating demand. Operators in control rooms monitored load levels, making adjustments to keep supply and demand in balance. The interconnected nature of the grid meant that problems in one area could cascade to others, so vigilance was constant. In some regions, utilities issued conservation appeals, asking customers to reduce non-essential electricity use to ease the strain. Hospital workers faced their own set of challenges. Emergency rooms prepared for an influx of cold-related cases. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exacerbation of respiratory conditions in people who had been exposed to the bitter air. Staff who lived far from their workplaces sometimes stayed overnight rather than face dangerous commutes between shifts. The hospitals themselves had to maintain heating and power, with facilities managers monitoring systems that were essential to patient care. Transit workers kept whatever services remained running. In cities where subways and buses continued to operate on reduced schedules, drivers and operators showed up for shifts despite conditions that made getting to work difficult and sometimes dangerous. They guided vehicles through streets that might be icy, managed doors and heating systems that were stressed by the cold, and provided the essential service of movement for people who had no other options. Maintenance workers in rail yards and bus depots performed cold weather preparations, checking equipment and making repairs that would keep vehicles operational. Emergency responders remained on duty throughout the cold snap. Firefighters answered calls, their equipment challenged by temperatures that could freeze water lines and make ice-covered surfaces treacherous. Police officers patrolled streets that were mostly empty, responding to the calls that did come in and checking on locations where vulnerable people might be in danger. Paramedics transported patients through conditions that added difficulty to every aspect of their work, from keeping patients warm to navigating icy roads. Postal workers and delivery drivers faced decisions about what could and could not be safely delivered. The Postal Service has a famous creed about neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night staying couriers from their appointed rounds. But extreme cold added a new variable. Some deliveries were postponed, particularly in areas where road conditions were dangerous, or where walking routes exposed carriers to unacceptable risk. Others continued, with workers bundled in multiple layers, moving quickly between their vehicles and the doors where packages and letters were dropped. Grocery store employees kept stores open, often in buildings where temperatures were difficult to maintain near the entrance doors. They stocked shelves that had been depleted by pre-storm shopping, working in gloves and coats, serving customers who braved the cold to pick up essential items. The supply chain that kept stores stocked faced its own challenges, with truckers navigating icy highways and warehouses operating in conditions that strained heating systems and made loading docks uncomfortable places to work. Behind all these visible workers were others, whose efforts were less apparent. Dispatchers coordinated emergency responses from warm offices. IT staff kept systems running that allowed remote work and communication. Managers made decisions about closures and staffing, balancing safety against the need to maintain services. The functioning of daily life during extreme weather depends on countless decisions and actions, most of which happen out of sight. If you've drifted and come back, we are alongside the workers who stayed at their posts through the coldest hours. Their efforts are quiet but essential to the communities they serve. The polar vortex touched different lives in different ways. For children, elders, and the animals that live alongside us, the extreme cold brought particular experiences, small stories of adaptation and care that played out in homes across the affected regions. Children found themselves unexpectedly home from school, the normal routines of their days suddenly suspended. For some, this was a gift. Snow days without the snow activities, perhaps, but still days free from homework and schedules. They built forts from couch cushions and blankets, creating enclosed spaces within the already enclosed space of home. They played games that had been forgotten in closets, rediscovering puzzles and board games and decks of cards that now had new appeal. Parents who were also trying to work from home found the combination challenging. Video calls were interrupted by children wandering into camera view. Deadlines competed with requests for snacks and entertainment. The balance was imperfect, but it was also an opportunity for time together that normal schedules rarely allowed. Some families took advantage of the forced togetherness, using the days for activities that busy weekdays usually pushed aside. For some children, the cold brought genuine hardship. In homes where heating was inadequate or had failed, children felt the cold most acutely. Their smaller bodies lose heat faster than adult bodies, making them more vulnerable to the effects of low temperatures. Parents in these situations faced difficult choices, bundling children in every available piece of clothing, gathering the family into the warmest room, or seeking help at warming centers where the temperature could be controlled. Elderly residents experienced the cold snap through the lens of memory and vulnerability. Many had lived through cold winters before and could compare this one to others in their experience. The comparisons sometimes minimized the current cold. Stories of walking to school in worse weather, of houses heated only by wood stoves, of childhoods before central heating was common. Other times the comparisons acknowledged that this cold was unusual, beyond what memory could easily match. The practical concerns for elderly residents were significant. Many lived alone, their daily routines already marked by limited mobility and contact. During the cold snap, that isolation deepened. Trips outside that might normally be manageable became impossible. Supplies that would usually be replenished on regular shopping trips had to last longer. The thermostat, often a source of tension between comfort and economy, was watched with particular attention. Neighbors and family members checked on elderly residents with increased frequency. Phone calls that might normally happen weekly became daily. In some cases, younger family members or friends made trips through the cold to deliver groceries or simply to sit with someone for a while. These visits served practical purposes, but also social ones, breaking the isolation that the weather imposed and providing reassurance that someone was paying attention. Pets adapted to the cold in their own ways. Dogs who normally enjoyed long walks found their outdoor time severely curtailed. Owners braved the cold to give their animals opportunities to relieve themselves, but the walks were brief, quick trips to the nearest appropriate spot and then back inside. Some dogs seemed confused by the abbreviated outings, others relieved to return to warmth. The small dog boots that had seemed like a luxury item proved their worth, protecting paws from ice and salt. Cats, most of whom lived entirely indoors, experienced the cold mainly through the windows. They watched the world outside with their usual intensity, perhaps noting that the birds were fewer and the squirrels were absent. Indoor cats curled in spots near heat sources, on radiators where possible, near vents, in sunbeams that moved across floors during the short winter days. Their ability to find the warmest spot in any room became more noticeable when warmth was at a premium. For animals who lived outside, the cold was more serious. Farm animals in rural areas required extra care. Additional feed to generate body heat, access to shelter, water sources that would not freeze. In suburban and urban areas, concerns arose about stray cats and feral colonies, animals who normally survived outdoors but faced life-threatening conditions in the extreme cold. Volunteers set out shelters and food, doing what they could for animals beyond their direct care. The polar vortex in these small stories revealed the texture of daily life in ways that normal weather does not. The relationship between parent and child, between neighbor and neighbor, between person and pet, all of these became more visible when the cold pressed everyone indoors, and the usual distractions fell away. What remained was fundamental: warmth, shelter, and the care that connects living beings to one another. If your mind has been far away, we are with the youngest and oldest now, and the animals beside them. All are finding ways to move gently through the cold spell, their small stories part of the larger experience of these unusual days. The systems that normally deliver goods and services to people's doors slowed during the polar vortex, creating ripples through the routines of daily life. Grocery stores, delivery services, and the mail all adapted to conditions that made their usual operations difficult, and the people who depended on them adjusted in turn. In the days before the coldest weather arrived, grocery stores had seen a surge of customers. The pattern was familiar from any predicted weather event. Bread, milk, eggs, and canned goods moved quickly from shelves to shopping carts. Batteries and flashlights were popular, as were the items that had become standard preparation for any potential emergency. By the time the cold actually hit, many stores had depleted their stocks of the most sought-after items, leaving shelves with gaps that would take days to refill. During the cold snap itself, grocery stores operated under modified conditions. Some reduced their hours, opening later and closing earlier to protect employees from the coldest parts of the day. Others remained open but with reduced staffing, as employees who could not safely travel to work stayed home. The stores that did open were quieter than usual, with fewer shoppers willing to brave the cold for items that were not essential. For those who did venture out to shop, the experience was one of rapid efficiency. People moved quickly through aisles, grabbing what they needed without the usual browsing. Checkout lines were short but moved with deliberate speed, everyone eager to complete their business and return to warmth. The small talk that sometimes occurs between cashier and customer was abbreviated. Smiles exchanged through the scarves and coats that people kept on even inside the store. Delivery services, which had become an increasingly important part of how people receive goods, faced significant challenges. The apps and websites that allowed people to order groceries, meals, and packages to their doors still functioned, but the delivery itself was complicated. Drivers and couriers who would normally work through light snow or cold rain found themselves facing conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Some services suspended operations entirely during the worst of the cold. Others continued, but with warnings about delays and reduced availability. The workers who did deliver during the polar vortex earned a particular kind of gratitude. A pizza arriving hot, a bag of groceries left at a door, a package delivered despite the conditions. These small arrivals felt more significant when the person bringing them had braved extreme cold to do so. Tips for those who could afford them often ran higher than usual, a recognition that the service being provided came at a personal cost to the person providing it. The mail, that reliable daily connection to the outside world, slowed but did not stop. Postal carriers modified their routes and their methods, spending less time on the street, moving more quickly between deliveries. In some areas, mail was held for a day or two rather than risking carrier safety on icy sidewalks. When it did resume, there was often a backlog, multiple days' worth of letters and advertisements arriving at once. For people who depended on the mail for important items, the delays were concerning. Medications that arrived by mail-order pharmacy were particularly anxiety-inducing when they failed to appear on schedule. Important documents, bills, and communications from distant family all entered a kind of limbo, somewhere in the system but not yet arrived. The reliability that the mail usually offers, the assumption that what is sent will arrive in a predictable time frame, was temporarily suspended. Packages that had been ordered before the cold snap arrived in unpredictable patterns. Some sat in warehouses, waiting for conditions to improve. Others made it partway to their destinations before being held at distribution centers. The tracking information that normally provided reassurance now showed items stuck in the same location for days at a time, their status unchanging as the cold prevented normal operations. When the deliveries did resume, there was a small pleasure in their return. The thump of a package on a porch, the envelopes in the mailbox, the notification that an order was on its way. These ordinary signals of connection to the commercial world took on a slightly different meaning after their absence. They were reminders that the systems underpinning daily life, while vulnerable to extreme weather, were also resilient, capable of resuming their functions once conditions allowed. The disruptions to these services revealed how much daily life has come to depend on the smooth flow of goods. When stores are fully stocked, when delivery apps connect a desire to a doorstep, when the mail arrives reliably, these systems fade into the background. The polar vortex brought them briefly into view, allowing people to see the infrastructure of convenience and to appreciate, at least for a moment, the workers and systems that sustain it. If you've returned to us, we're moving through quiet stores and mailrooms. We watch the everyday networks of food and parcels slow, and then adapt to the freeze, their temporary disruption making their normal function more visible. The nights during the polar vortex had a particular quality. As temperatures dropped to their lowest points in the hours before dawn, people across the affected regions kept watch, monitoring the systems that stood between their homes and the cold outside. In the darkness, small vigilances took on outsized importance. In apartments and houses, the night watch meant staying alert to the sounds and signs of heating systems working or failing. The click of a furnace cycling on, the hiss of steam through radiators, the hum of a space heater. These sounds became more significant in the quiet of the night. People woke at intervals to check thermostats, to feel the air in different rooms, to make sure that the dripping faucets were still dripping, and that the warmth they had cultivated was holding against the cold outside. Some households assigned shifts, one family member staying up late while another planned to wake early, ensuring that someone was awake through the most dangerous hours. The tradition of keeping watch through the night is an old one, rooted in times when fires needed tending and dangers lurked in darkness. During the polar vortex, that tradition found a modern expression. The watchfulness directed at thermostats and pipes rather than at flickering flames or prowling animals. Through apartment windows across the cities, scattered lights marked the homes where people were awake. In towers that might normally go dark by midnight, individual windows glowed, their light a visible sign of the quiet vigilance happening inside. From the street looking up, these lit windows formed a kind of constellation, points of warmth and wakefulness dotting the dark facades of buildings. The view through those windows offered little movement but much to observe. Snow that had fallen earlier lay, undisturbed on rooftops and ledges. The streets below were empty except for the occasional vehicle, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The steam rising from manholes and vents seemed thicker in the extreme cold, visible clouds marking the places where underground heat met the freezing surface air. On the glass itself, frost formed in patterns that seemed almost artistic. The crystals grew from the edges inward, creating fern-like shapes and feathery lines that caught the light from inside the room. These frost patterns, technically the result of water vapor in the air meeting a surface cold enough to freeze it, have a beauty that transcends their scientific explanation. People photographed them, traced them with fingers, watched them grow as the night wore on. Underground, a different kind of navigation took place. In cities with extensive tunnel systems, people moved through passages that connected buildings without exposure to the outside air. Universities with tunnel networks saw students and staff using routes that might normally be ignored, preferring the fluorescent-lit corridors to the frozen surface above. Hospitals used their basement connections to move patients and supplies without exposing anyone to the cold. In Minneapolis, the Skyway system came into its own. This network of enclosed, elevated walkways connects buildings throughout the downtown area, allowing people to travel for blocks without stepping outside. During the polar vortex, the skyways were busier than the streets below, their climate-controlled interiors a refuge for anyone who needed to move through the city. Workers walked from parking ramps to offices. Shoppers moved between stores, all without facing the wind chills that made outdoor movement dangerous. The experience of moving through these enclosed passages during extreme cold had an almost submarine quality. The world outside, visible through windows, was hostile and uninhabitable without protection. Inside the tunnels and skyways, life continued, warmer and safer, but also separated from the natural environment by layers of glass and concrete. The contrast made the engineering achievements of these systems more visible. The infrastructure that makes northern cities livable during harsh winters. In the tunnels beneath hospitals and campuses, the sounds were different from the streets above. Footsteps echoed off hard surfaces. The hum of ventilation systems provided constant background noise. Pipes ran along ceilings, carrying heat and water and steam. These underground passages, usually taken for granted, became during the cold snap a form of shelter, their consistent temperatures a gift during days when the air outside could harm exposed skin in minutes. As the night wore on and dawn approached, the quality of the vigilance shifted. The darkest hours, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning, were often the coldest. Those who were awake during these hours knew that they were experiencing the extremity of the cold snap, the point at which temperatures bottomed out before beginning the slow climb that would come with sunrise. Surviving these hours, keeping the heat running and the pipes flowing, felt like a small but genuine accomplishment. If you are drifting in and out, we are in the long blue hours now. A few lights stay on behind frosted windows, while most of the city sleeps, and the quiet watch continues against the cold that presses at every wall. The polar vortex brought with it a set of hazards that required attention and care. These were not dramatic dangers but quiet ones, risks that accumulated through exposure or inattention, and that could be managed with knowledge and caution. Across the affected regions, people learned to navigate these hazards, adjusting their behavior to the conditions. Frostbite was the most personal of the risks. Exposed skin, in the wind chills that accompanied the polar vortex, could begin to suffer damage in a matter of minutes. The process is gradual at first. Numbness, a waxy appearance to the skin, a loss of sensation that might not be immediately noticeable. By the time pain appears, damage has often already occurred. The warnings that went out during the cold snap emphasized covering all exposed skin, limiting time outdoors, and recognizing the early signs of frostbite before they progressed to more serious injury. People adapted by bundling more completely than they might in ordinary cold. Faces were covered with scarves or balaclavas, leaving only small slits for eyes. Hands were double-gloved, with thin liners beneath heavier outer layers. Feet, particularly vulnerable because they are furthest from the heart, received extra socks and the most insulated boots available. The transformation in appearance was striking. People on the streets, what few there were, looked like explorers setting out for the poles rather than commuters heading to work. Black ice presented a different kind of hazard. This thin, transparent layer of ice forms when moisture freezes on cold surfaces, creating a slick coating that is nearly invisible. Sidewalks and streets that appeared merely wet were often treacherously icy, offering no grip to shoes or tires. Falls were common, some minor, others resulting in injuries that required medical attention. The elderly were particularly vulnerable, their bones more brittle, and their balance sometimes less sure. The response to black ice was salt and sand, spread on sidewalks and steps by building staff and residents. The crunch of salt crystals underfoot became a familiar sound, a signal that someone had tried to make the path safer. In areas where salt was scarce, or where no one had taken responsibility for treating the surfaces, walking required extreme caution, a shuffling gait with weight centered carefully, each step tested before committing. Roofs accumulated snow and ice that added weight to structures. In most cases, modern buildings are designed to handle significant snow loads, and the polar vortex did not bring particularly heavy snowfall. But in older buildings or those with flat roofs where drainage might be compromised, the weight of accumulated ice could cause concern. Building managers monitored their roofs, looking for signs of stress or water infiltration that might indicate problems. Carbon monoxide emerged as a serious hazard in some homes. When heating systems fail, or when people seek alternative ways to warm their homes, the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning increases. Generators brought inside, gas stoves left burning for heat, cars running in attached garages. All of these can produce carbon monoxide, an odorless gas that can cause illness and death. Emergency responders saw an uptick in carbon monoxide calls during the polar vortex, as some households made desperate attempts to stay warm that put them at risk. The public safety messages that went out during the cold snap emphasized these hidden dangers. Never use a generator indoors. Never heat your home with a gas stove or oven. Make sure carbon monoxide detectors are working. Ventilate any space where fuel is being burned. These messages, repeated on news broadcasts and social media, were attempts to prevent the kind of tragedies that can occur when people take risks to escape the cold. Pipes, as mentioned earlier, faced the risk of freezing and bursting. The precautions against this, dripping faucets and open cabinets, became standard practice. But in buildings where these measures were not taken, or where the cold was simply too intense for prevention, pipes did freeze. When they subsequently thawed, the cracks that had formed released water into walls, ceilings, and floors. The damage from burst pipes could far exceed any inconvenience from the cold itself, requiring repairs that took weeks or months and cost thousands of dollars. The hazards of the polar vortex were manageable, but they required attention. They were risks that rewarded knowledge and preparation, punishing carelessness or ignorance. The experience of navigating them was educational in a way, a reminder that extreme weather demands respect and adjustment, and that the normal rules of daily life must bend to accommodate conditions that fall outside the usual range. If your attention has wandered, we are moving carefully now, one step at a time, through the risks that cold and ice quietly bring. We are learning the precautions that keep people safe when temperatures fall beyond the ordinary. After the most intense days of the polar vortex, the cold began to ease. The change was not dramatic, not a sudden warming, but rather a gradual lifting of the extreme conditions. Weather maps that had been dominated by deep purples and blues began to show lighter colors, and the forecasts spoke of temperatures rising, still cold by normal standards, but no longer in the life-threatening range. The first sign many people noticed was the feel of the air. Stepping outside on a day when the temperature was 10 degrees above zero, after days of 20 or 30 below, felt almost warm by comparison. The relative warmth was an illusion, of course, still dangerous for prolonged exposure, but the contrast with what had come before was unmistakable. Breath still fogged, cheeks still reddened, but the brutal edge was gone. In offices and schools, decisions were made about when to resume normal operations. Some institutions reopened as soon as the most dangerous cold passed, their leaders judging that conditions were safe enough for travel and work. Others waited a day or two longer, wanting to be sure that the warming trend was real and not a brief pause before another plunge. The return to normalcy was staggered, creating a transitional period when some parts of life had resumed, while others remained on hold. On the streets, the return of activity was gradual. More cars appeared, their drivers venturing out for errands that had been postponed during the worst of the cold. Pedestrians who had been absent returned, walking with more confidence, though still bundled against temperatures that remained well below freezing. The sense of isolation that had marked the peak of the cold snap began to lift, replaced by a tentative reconnection with the outside world. The snow and ice that had accumulated during the polar vortex did not immediately melt. Temperatures rose, but not high enough to cause rapid thawing. Banks of snow lined streets and covered sidewalks. Ice clung to surfaces that received little direct sunlight. The visual evidence of the cold remained even as the worst of it passed, a landscape still dressed in winter white while the atmosphere gradually warmed. For people who had been shut in during the most extreme days, the easing brought a particular kind of relief. Cabin fever, that restlessness that comes from too much time indoors, began to ease as people realized they could safely spend more time outside. Short walks that had been impossible or inadvisable became possible again. The simple pleasure of leaving the house without elaborate preparation for extreme cold was a small but genuine joy. The psychological weight of the cold snap lifted along with the temperatures. During the most intense days, there had been an undercurrent of anxiety, an awareness that conditions outside were genuinely dangerous, and that the systems keeping people warm could fail. As the cold eased, that anxiety diminished. The situation was returning to normal, or at least to something closer to normal, and the hypervigilance that had characterized the coldest days could relax. In homes, the rituals that had been established to cope with the cold began to wind down. Faucets that had been left dripping were turned off. Thermostats that had been turned up were adjusted back toward their usual settings. Blankets that had been hung over windows for insulation were taken down. The emergency mode of living that had characterized the polar vortex gave way to something more ordinary, still winter, still cold, but no longer exceptional. The transition was not instantaneous. For days after the worst had passed, people remained more cautious than usual, more attentive to weather forecasts, more prepared for the possibility that extreme conditions might return. The polar vortex had been a reminder of how quickly normal life could be disrupted by weather, and that reminder lingered even as conditions improved. People who had not previously thought much about emergency preparedness found themselves considering it differently, wondering what they might do if such conditions returned. The quiet interval between the crisis and full normalcy had its own character. It was a time for catching up, for dealing with tasks that had been postponed, for reconnecting with people who had been out of reach. It was also a time for processing, for making sense of what had happened and what it had meant. The polar vortex of 2019 was already becoming a memory, a story that people would tell about the time it got so cold that normal life had to stop. If you've been elsewhere in thought, we are in the in-between days now, when the worst has passed but the world is still wrapped in winter. The relief of rising temperatures begins to settle over cities that had been held in the grip of extraordinary cold. The first real warmth arrived not with a dramatic shift, but with a softening, a gentle easing that people noticed in small ways before they could name it. The morning light came earlier now, or seemed to, pale yellow spreading across snow that had been gray and blue for days. The air still held cold, but it was a different cold, one that did not immediately sting the lungs or force eyes to water. People who had been watching thermometers and weather apps saw the numbers climb, slowly but unmistakably, from the dangerous negatives into something more familiar, something that felt like winter rather than emergency. In apartments across New York City, families stirred earlier than they had during the worst of the freeze. Children who had grown restless indoors pressed their faces to windows that were still rimmed with frost, but showed a world that looked less forbidding than it had the day before. Parents considered the possibility of a short walk, weighing the cold against the need for movement, for fresh air, for the simple pleasure of being outside after days of confinement. The decision was made in kitchens over coffee and cereal, in hallways where coats and boots were pulled from closets and layered on with the careful attention that deep cold requires. The first steps outside felt significant, even when they were only to the corner and back. Sidewalks that had been nearly empty now showed scattered pedestrians, bundled figures moving with a new confidence, their breath still visible, but their shoulders less hunched against the wind. The cold nipped at cheeks and noses, turning them pink within minutes, but it no longer felt aggressive. It felt manageable. It felt like something that could be endured for more than the few seconds required to dash from door to car, or from subway entrance to building lobby. In Central Park, the paths were quiet but not deserted. Dog walkers appeared with their bundled companions, the dogs sniffing at snow that had developed a crust overnight, their paws leaving neat prints in the surface before breaking through to the softer layers beneath. Runners emerged too, their breath forming small clouds that trailed behind them as they moved along routes they had abandoned during the freeze. Park benches remained buried or nearly so, their iron arms poking through drifts, but people paused near them anyway, looking out at the frozen landscape with something like appreciation now that they were no longer trapped by it. The Midwestern cities that had borne the brunt of the cold experienced similar awakenings. In Chicago, families walked along the lakefront where ice had formed in dramatic sheets and sculptures along the shore. The lake itself remained partly open, steam rising from the water where it met the frigid air, creating an otherworldly scene that drew photographers and curious residents despite the lingering chill. In Minneapolis, where the cold had been most severe, people ventured into neighborhoods that had been silent for days. They greeted neighbors they had checked on only by phone, standing in driveways and on sidewalks to exchange stories of how they had managed. Children discovered the snow with renewed enthusiasm. They tested its texture, finding it sometimes powdery and sometimes crusted, learning which patches would pack into snowballs and which would crumble at the touch. They made snow angels in yards and parks, their small bodies pressing impressions into surfaces that had been undisturbed for days. Parents watched from porches and sidewalks, keeping outings brief, but allowing the joy of play to unfold in ways that had been impossible when the wind chill made any exposure dangerous. The light itself seemed different during these first ventures outside. The sun hung low on the horizon, as it does in late January, but its rays felt warmer on faces turned toward it. Shadows stretched long across the snow, blue and purple against the white, creating patterns that shifted as the morning progressed. People paused to notice these things, to look at the ice that had formed on railings and branches, to observe the way the cold had transformed familiar landscapes into something beautiful and strange. Rivers and waterways showed the marks of the freeze. In New York, the Hudson and East Rivers had developed ice along their edges, though the main channels remained open for boat traffic. People gathered at overlooks and riverside parks to see the unusual sight of ice forming on waters that rarely froze, taking photographs that would be shared and remembered long after the cold had passed. In the Midwest, where lakes and rivers froze more regularly, the ice was thicker and more dramatic, with pressure ridges and frozen spray creating formations that looked almost architectural. The experience of emerging from the freeze was both individual and collective. Each person who stepped outside during those first warming days carried their own sense of relief, their own memories of the coldest hours, their own appreciation for the simple act of walking without pain or danger. But there was also something shared in it, a communal recognition that a difficult period was ending, that the city or town was coming back to life, that the worst had passed and would eventually become just another winter story to tell. Windows that had been sealed tight during the freeze were opened briefly in some homes, just a crack, to let in fresh air that no longer felt like an assault. The sound of the outside world, muted for days, began to return. Traffic noises, distant voices, the scrape of shovels on pavement. These sounds, usually unremarkable, carried a different weight now. They were evidence of movement, of recovery, of a world returning to its normal rhythms after a pause that had felt, for some, like a held breath finally released. If you're rejoining us, we are outside again, feeling the air begin to soften as people take their first unhurried steps through the winter light. The worst of the cold is behind them, and the city is slowly stirring back to life. With the temperatures moderating, attention turned to the practical work of clearing what the freeze had left behind. The snow that had fallen before and during the coldest days remained, compacted in places, drifted in others, and everywhere marked by the passage of those difficult days. Sidewalks that had been abandoned to the elements now needed to be reclaimed, and across the affected regions, the sound of shovels scraping against concrete became a familiar rhythm, a percussion of recovery that echoed through neighborhoods and business districts alike. In New York City, building superintendents emerged to clear stoops and entranceways that had accumulated layers of snow and ice. The work was methodical, starting at doorways and extending outward to meet the paths being carved by neighbors and city crews. Salt and sand were spread over surfaces that remained slick, the granules crunching underfoot and leaving dark tracks on the white. Hydrants buried during the freeze were excavated, their red tops appearing like small beacons as the snow around them was pushed aside. The city's sanitation department deployed plows and salt spreaders along routes that had been cleared once during the storm, but had since accumulated more snow or developed icy patches from melting and refreezing. The trucks moved slowly through residential streets, their blades scraping against pavement, pushing aside the remnants of the freeze and leaving behind surfaces that, while still wet and cold, were navigable again. Behind the plows, foot traffic resumed, people walking more confidently now that the paths were clear. Public transit systems announced the restoration of normal service, and the news spread through apps and announcements and word of mouth. Subway stations that had seen reduced traffic during the freeze began to fill again, the platforms crowded with commuters who had been working from home or not working at all. Buses returned to their full schedules, pulling into stops where passengers waited in the cold, but with less apprehension than they had felt days before. The familiar routines of urban transit, disrupted by the extreme weather, clicked back into place with a reassuring regularity. In the Midwest, where the cold had been more severe and the disruptions more extensive, the return to normal took longer but followed similar patterns. Airports that had canceled hundreds of flights reopened, their runways cleared, and their equipment functioning again after the strain of the freeze. Travelers who had been stranded or delayed finally boarded planes, their journeys resuming after unexpected pauses. The flow of goods and people that had slowed to a trickle began to move again, the networks of modern life reactivating after a period of enforced stillness. The reconnections were personal as well as practical. Families who had been separated by the impassable roads and canceled flights were reunited, their embraces carrying the weight of days spent worrying and waiting. Friends who had checked on each other by phone during the freeze now met in person, sharing stories over coffee in shops that had reopened, comparing notes on how they had managed the cold. The conversations were often similar, circling around the same topics: how cold it had gotten, how long the power had held, whether the pipes had survived, what they had eaten when they couldn't get to the store. Neighbors who had barely known each other before the freeze found that they now had shared experiences to discuss. The elderly woman who had received groceries from the young couple down the hall, the family whose space heater had been borrowed by a neighbor whose furnace had struggled, the building where residents had gathered in the lobby, the warmest common space, to wait out the worst of the cold together. These small connections, formed under pressure, created bonds that would persist long after the weather normalized. Offices and schools filled gradually as closures ended and normal schedules resumed. Children returned to classrooms where teachers asked about their experiences during the freeze, turning the disruption into an opportunity for discussion and reflection. Workers returned to desks and stations that had been empty for days, catching up on tasks that had been delayed and comparing stories with colleagues who had weathered the cold in different ways. The rhythm of work and school, suspended during the worst of the freeze, resumed with a sense of appreciation for its ordinariness. Shops that had closed or operated on reduced hours during the freeze reopened fully, their aisles restocked after the rush of pre-storm shopping. Grocery stores received deliveries that had been delayed by icy roads, their shelves filling again with bread and milk and eggs, the staples that had run low during the worst days. Restaurants that had closed when business dropped to nothing reopened their doors, welcoming customers who were hungry for meals they hadn't had to cook themselves, and for the simple pleasure of being out in the world again. The reconnections extended to the rhythms of daily life that had been disrupted. Mail that had accumulated at post offices and in trucks parked at depots began moving again, letters and packages reaching their destinations after unexpected delays. Delivery services resumed their rounds, dropping off items that had been ordered before the freeze and finally arriving now that the roads were clear. The small transactions that make up so much of modern life, interrupted by the cold, resumed with quiet efficiency. The work of clearing and reconnecting was not glamorous, but it was essential. Each shovel of snow removed, each path cleared, each bus that ran on schedule represented a small step back toward normalcy. The freeze had demonstrated how quickly the ordinary systems of life could be disrupted, and the recovery demonstrated how steadily they could be restored when people worked together. One cleared sidewalk, and one resumed connection at a time. If you have slipped away and come back, we are watching pathways reappear and connections reform. People begin to move more freely through their towns and cities, the work of recovery quiet but steady. As the immediate concerns of the freeze receded, people began to notice what the cold had left behind. Not the difficulties or the disruptions, but something else, a strange and temporary beauty that existed only because of the extreme conditions that had just passed. The same cold that had endangered pipes and strained power grids had also created formations of ice and frost that would not have existed in an ordinary winter. As the worst of the danger faded, there was space to appreciate these small wonders before they melted away. Icicles hung from fire escapes and eaves throughout New York City, some of them several feet long, tapering to delicate points that caught the winter light and glinted like crystal. Children pointed at them from sidewalks, marveling at their size and asking questions about how they formed. Parents who had been too focused on survival during the freeze now paused to look as well, seeing in the icicles a kind of compensation for the difficulties of the past days. The formations were temporary, already beginning to drip in the warmer temperatures, but their presence was a reminder that even harsh conditions can produce unexpected beauty. Windows throughout the affected regions displayed frost patterns that had formed during the coldest nights. These were not the simple sheets of ice that might appear in an ordinary cold snap, but intricate formations that resembled ferns or feathers, their delicate structures spreading across glass in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. People photographed them before they melted, capturing images that would be shared online and saved as records of a remarkable winter. The frost patterns were fleeting, disappearing as indoor heat and outdoor warmth combined to clear the glass. But for a few hours or days, they transformed ordinary windows into works of natural art. Stories circulated about experiments people had tried during the coldest hours. In the Midwest, where temperatures had dropped to truly extreme levels, some had tossed cups of hot water into the air and watched as the liquid crystallized almost instantly, falling as a cloud of ice particles rather than splashing to the ground. Others had blown soap bubbles and observed as they froze in midair, their surfaces becoming rigid and opaque before shattering or drifting away. These experiments, shared in videos and photos, became part of the collective memory of the freeze, evidence of just how cold it had been, and how that cold could transform the ordinary into something magical. The natural world offered its own displays. Trees that had been coated in freezing rain or accumulated frost stood like sculptures, their branches encased in ice that caught the light and created rainbow effects, where the sun struck at the right angle. Parks and forests became galleries of ice art, their paths lined with crystalline formations that would persist only until the next significant warmth. Photographers ventured out to capture these scenes, their cameras recording images that would serve as documentation of a winter that had been, for a few days at least, truly extraordinary. Rivers and lakes showed the marks of the freeze in dramatic ways. Ice that had formed along shorelines and in shallow areas displayed patterns of cracking and refreezing, creating textures that looked like abstract paintings when viewed from above. In places where the water had remained open, steam continued to rise where cold air met relatively warmer water, creating mist effects that photographers found irresistible. These scenes would change as temperatures continued to moderate, the ice retreating and the mist dissipating. But for the moment, they offered visual evidence of what the region had just experienced. People shared their discoveries with each other, both in person and online. Social media filled with images of the freeze's beautiful aftermath. Icicles and frost patterns, frozen bubbles and crystallized spray, snow formations and ice sculptures created by wind and cold. The sharing was a way of processing the experience, of finding meaning and even pleasure in something that had been difficult. The same cold that had kept people indoors and disrupted their lives had also created moments of beauty that they could appreciate and remember. Children were especially attentive to these small wonders. They examined icicles up close, touching them carefully and watching as their warmth left fingerprints in the ice. They searched for the largest formations, competing gently to find the most impressive examples. They noticed details that adults might overlook: the way light passed through ice, the sound it made when it broke, the patterns it left on surfaces. For them, the aftermath of the freeze was a treasure hunt, an opportunity to explore a world temporarily transformed by cold. The appreciation of beauty was also a form of recovery. It marked a shift from survival mode, where every thought was focused on warmth and safety, to something more relaxed, where there was mental space for wonder and observation. The ability to pause and appreciate an icicle or a frost pattern was a sign that the crisis had passed, that life was returning to a pace where such things could be noticed. The small wonders of the aftermath were gifts, brief and melting, but real and worth the attention they received. If your mind has been wandering, we're pausing over the small, harmless wonders the cold left behind, before they vanish with the thaw. They are a gentle reminder that even difficult days can leave something beautiful. As the freeze released its grip and movement became easier, people turned their attention to the rituals of warmth and connection that had been constrained during the coldest days. Kitchens that had been focused on simple survival, on whatever could be prepared with limited supplies and uncertain power, now became spaces for real cooking, for the preparation of meals that were about more than just sustenance. The smell of soup simmering on stovetops drifted through apartments and houses, a sensory signal that the worst was over and that comfort could be found again. Families who had eaten whatever was available during the freeze now had access to fuller pantries and fresh ingredients. Grocery runs that had been impossible or inadvisable were now routine again, and people returned home with the supplies needed to make the foods that felt right for winter. Thick stews with vegetables and meat, casseroles that could warm both kitchen and spirit, baked goods that filled homes with the scent of flour and butter and warmth. The cooking was deliberate and unhurried, a contrast to the quick meals of the crisis days, and it served purposes beyond nutrition. The preparation of food became a way of processing the experience. Parents cooked while telling children about the coldest nights, about the precautions they had taken and the worries they had carried. Couples worked together in kitchens, their movements coordinated by years of practice, their conversations touching on what they had felt during the freeze and what they were grateful for now that it was over. The act of making a meal, of transforming raw ingredients into something warm and nourishing, was itself a form of recovery, a reassertion of normalcy after days when nothing had felt normal. Neighbors who had helped each other during the freeze found reasons to connect again, now that the danger had passed. A pot of soup made in one kitchen might find its way to a neighbor who had shared supplies during the worst days. Cookies baked in celebration of the returning warmth might be delivered to the elderly resident down the hall who had been checked on repeatedly during the cold. These exchanges were both practical and symbolic, acknowledgments of the connections that had been formed or strengthened when everyone was focused on getting through together. Informal gatherings emerged as travel became easier and concerns about exposure faded. Friends who had stayed in touch by phone during the freeze met in person, gathering in living rooms and kitchens to share hot drinks and stories. The conversations circled around the shared experience. How cold had it gotten in your apartment? Did your pipes survive? What did you eat when you couldn't get to the store? Did you lose power even briefly? The stories were sometimes dramatic and sometimes mundane, but they were shared with the understanding that everyone had been through something together. The meals themselves carried meaning beyond their ingredients. A bowl of soup eaten at a kitchen table, steam rising in the lamplight, represented safety and warmth and the end of deprivation. A cup of tea shared with a neighbor was both a beverage and a gesture of connection. The act of sitting down together, of breaking bread in the oldest sense of the phrase, was a way of marking the transition from crisis to recovery, from isolation to community. Children participated in these meals with appetites sharpened by days of limited options. They ate the warm foods their parents prepared with enthusiasm, their plates cleaned, and second helpings requested. They listened to the adult conversations about the freeze, absorbing the stories and the emotions, learning without being taught how communities respond to difficulty, and how recovery happens one shared meal at a time. The bonds formed or strengthened during the freeze would persist beyond the winter. Neighbors who had checked on each other during the cold would continue to greet each other in hallways and on streets. Families who had pooled resources would remember each other's generosity and find ways to reciprocate. The freeze had been difficult, but it had also created connections that might not have formed otherwise. Links between people who had been strangers or acquaintances and were now something more. In restaurants and cafes that had reopened after the freeze, similar scenes played out in more public settings. People gathered to eat meals they hadn't had to prepare themselves, to sit in warm spaces surrounded by others, to feel part of a community that was returning to normal. The servers who brought food to tables and the cooks who prepared it in back kitchens were themselves part of the recovery. Workers who had been unable to work during the closures and were now back at their posts, earning wages and serving customers and participating in the return to ordinary life. The shared meals of the aftermath were celebrations, though quiet ones. They celebrated survival and recovery, connection and community, the simple pleasures of warmth and food and company. They marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, the transition from emergency to everyday. And they created memories that would be recalled in future winters, when cold weather arrived and people remembered the freeze they had shared and the meals that had marked its end. If you've been resting and return, we are at the tables now, where warmth comes as much from company and stories as from the food itself. The rituals of recovery are unfolding in kitchens and dining rooms across the region. As life returned to normal, attention shifted to understanding what had happened and preparing for what might come again. The systems that had been strained during the freeze, the power grids and gas networks and transportation systems, became subjects of review and analysis. The questions were practical. What had worked, what had struggled, and what could be done differently to handle future extreme cold events? The answers would take time to develop fully, but the process of learning began almost as soon as the temperatures moderated. Utility companies examined the performance of their equipment during the freeze. In regions where power outages had occurred, engineers traced the causes. Frozen components, overloaded circuits, failures in equipment that had not been designed for such extreme conditions. The analysis was technical and detailed, involving charts and data, and the testimony of workers who had been in the field during the worst of the cold. The goal was not to assign blame, but to identify vulnerabilities that could be addressed before the next cold event arrived. Gas companies reviewed the performance of their distribution systems, which had been under particular strain during the freeze. The demand for heating fuel had spiked dramatically as temperatures plummeted, And in some areas, the pressure in gas lines had dropped as supply struggled to keep up with demand. The companies examined their capacity and their contingency plans, looking for ways to ensure that future cold snaps would not create the same risks. The work was unglamorous but essential, the kind of behind-the-scenes analysis that keeps infrastructure functioning. Transit agencies assessed the performance of their systems during the freeze. Trains and buses that had been delayed or canceled, tracks and switches that had frozen, vehicles that had struggled to operate in the cold, all became subjects of review. The agencies looked for patterns that could guide future preparations. Which equipment needed cold weather modifications? Which routes were most vulnerable to disruption? How scheduling adjustments could minimize impact on riders during extreme weather events? The reviews extended beyond the agencies and utilities to individual households and businesses. People who had experienced difficulties during the freeze thought about what they might do differently next time. Those whose pipes had frozen considered insulation and heat tape. Those who had lost power briefly thought about backup heating options and battery supplies. Those who had run low on groceries resolved to keep fuller pantries during winter months. The learning was personal and practical, a quiet adjustment of habits and preparations. Hardware stores and home improvement retailers saw increased traffic in the days after the freeze, as people acted on the lessons they had learned. Pipe insulation sold well, as did weather stripping and draft blockers for doors and windows. Space heaters and emergency heating supplies drew attention from customers who had realized they might need backup options. The purchases were investments in future comfort and safety, practical responses to a recent reminder of what winter could do. Public health agencies and emergency management offices issued guidance based on the freeze experience. The messages reminded people about the signs of frostbite and hypothermia, about the importance of checking on vulnerable neighbors during cold snaps, about the dangers of using generators or outdoor heating equipment indoors. The guidance was not new, but it landed differently after people had lived through conditions where such information mattered. The freeze had made abstract warnings concrete, and the follow-up messaging reinforced lessons that had been learned through experience. Workplaces updated their emergency plans and communication systems, building on what had worked and addressing what hadn't. Businesses that had struggled to notify employees about closures improved their alert systems. Organizations that had found their backup plans inadequate revised them with the recent experience in mind. The changes were often small, adjustments to contact lists or procedures or supply inventories, but they represented a collective effort to be better prepared for future disruptions. The learning extended to broader conversations about climate and infrastructure. The polar vortex of 2019 became a reference point in discussions about extreme weather events and their increasing frequency. Questions about grid resilience, about building codes, about the capacity of systems designed for typical conditions to handle atypical ones, all gained relevance from the recent experience. The answers to these questions would unfold over years and decades, but the freeze had focused attention and created momentum for the work of adaptation. For individuals, the aftermath of the freeze brought a quiet awareness that would persist beyond the immediate recovery. People who had weathered the cold would carry the experience with them, a reference point that would shape their preparations and their responses to future warnings. The freeze had been a teacher, and the lessons, both practical and emotional, would inform how they approached winters to come. If your thoughts have drifted, we're looking at the gentle work of learning now. Both systems and households are adjusting for winters yet to come, the freeze becoming not just a memory but a guide for future preparation. And so we come to the end of this journey through the polar vortex of 2019, having traveled from the first forecasts to the final thaw. We have moved from the weather maps that showed deep blue spreading south to the streets, where people walked again in milder air. We have followed the cold as it arrived, watching transportation systems slow and then pause, observing cities grow quiet as offices closed and residents moved indoors. We have sat in living rooms where families gathered around space heaters and let faucets drip, and we have visited warming centers where strangers shared shelter and hot drinks. The freeze was a reminder of how much of modern life depends on systems that we rarely think about. The power grids that keep lights on and furnaces running, the gas networks that deliver fuel for heating, the transportation systems that move people and goods, the communication networks that keep us connected to each other and to information. When these systems are strained, as they were during the coldest days of the vortex, the vulnerability becomes visible. But so does the resilience, the ability of workers and communities to respond, to adapt, to keep essential services functioning even under difficult conditions. We have seen how people responded to the challenge, not with panic but with practical adaptation. They layered clothing and shared warmth. They checked on neighbors and offered what they had. They followed guidance about protecting pipes and avoiding frostbite. They waited patiently for the worst to pass, trusting that it would, understanding that extreme cold, like all weather, is temporary. The response was not perfect, and some people faced real hardship, but the overall picture was one of communities managing difficulty with competence and care. The aftermath brought its own experiences: the clearing of paths, the resumption of transit, the reconnection of people who had been separated by the weather. It brought small wonders too: the ice formations and frost patterns that existed only because of the extreme cold and would vanish with the returning warmth. And it brought shared meals and strengthened bonds, the gatherings around tables where people ate together and told stories of how they had managed, finding in the shared experience a kind of connection that ordinary times don't always provide. The polar vortex of 2019 has taken its place among the winter events that people remember, referenced in conversations about cold weather, cited in discussions about grid resilience and emergency preparedness. It was not the first such event and will not be the last. The polar vortex itself is a permanent feature of our atmosphere, a circulation of cold air around the poles that occasionally weakens and allows frigid air to spill southward. When it does, cities and towns that are not built for extreme cold must adapt quickly, and the process of adaptation reveals both vulnerabilities and strengths. For those who lived through it, the freeze of 2019 remains a vivid memory. The bite of the air on exposed skin, the hush of streets emptied by the cold, the glow of lamps in windows where people waited for warmth to return. These memories will inform how they respond to future cold events, shaping their preparations and their expectations. The freeze taught lessons that can be applied not just to weather, but to any disruption that requires adaptation, patience, and cooperation. As we close this telling, the streets are clear again, the transit systems are running on schedule, and the thermometers show temperatures that feel almost mild after what came before. The windows that were sealed against the cold have been opened to let in fresh air. The emergency supplies that were depleted have been restocked. Life has returned to its ordinary rhythms, with the freeze becoming just another winter memory, though one that carries more weight than most. If you've been listening as you drift toward sleep, you can let the story settle now. The cold came and people responded, and the cold eventually passed. That's the shape of it, simple and reassuring. The systems held for the most part. The communities held for the most part. And the warmth returned, as it always does. If you're hovering between waking and sleep, we are simply gathering the story together now, letting it rest like snow that has finally stopped falling, the journey complete and the night quiet around you.